The sea mist clung to the observatory dome like a shroud, perpetually dampening the glass, obscuring the precise, ordered cosmos I sought to understand. My solitude here, perched on a craggy outcrop overlooking the coastal fishing village old ways still practiced, was absolute. The village below, a scattering of weather-beaten shacks and stout stone buildings, huddled against the relentless ocean, its routines as ancient and predictable as the tides. I could sometimes smell the brine and wood smoke on the wind, a stark contrast to the sterile, ionized air of my control room. Their nets, their boats, their quiet, enduring superstitions felt a world away from the cold, silent data streams that were my life's companions. I lived by the hum of machinery, the soft click of relays, the rhythmic whir of cooling fans. My days were a precise sequence of calibration, data acquisition, and analysis. Each pixel, each spectral line, each faint whisper from the deep void was meticulously catalogued, scrutinized, filed. There was comfort in this order, a balm against the crushing enormity of space. I had chosen this life, this isolation, to escape the cacophony of human interaction, preferring the stark, honest language of the universe. My eyes were raw, burning from the blue glow of the monitors. The mug of lukewarm coffee, forgotten beside my keyboard, had long since grown a skin. I stretched, my back protesting with a series of dull aches, and rubbed the sleep from my face. Another night bled into another dawn, the sky outside a bruised purple, promising little light. It was so faint, so fleeting, that my automated filters had flagged it as an instrument error, a transient spike of interference. My protocol was to delete such anomalies and move on. My finger hovered over the command, but something held me back. I zoomed in, isolating the temporal window. The spike resolved into a series of discrete pulses, not random, not chaotic. There was a rhythm to it, a subtle, almost imperceptible repetition. My brow furrowed. I ran the sequence through a rudimentary pattern recognition algorithm. The results were inconclusive, bordering on nonsensical. "Just noise, Marcus," I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet room. "Go to bed." I ignored my own advice. The scientific mind, once snagged by an inconsistency, finds it impossible to let go. I recalibrated the receiver, double-checked the antenna alignment, ran diagnostic after diagnostic. Everything was operating within normal parameters. The equipment was sound. The signal, if it was one, was genuine. I spent the next 48 hours in a relentless cycle of reacquisition and analysis. My beard grew prickly, my clothes felt alien against my skin, and the taste in my mouth was stale and metallic. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. The sequence of pulses wasn't just repetitive, it was structured, like a language or a complex mathematical series, but unlike any I had ever encountered. It defied conventional astrophysical explanation. No known natural phenomenon could produce such intricate, non-random regularity from such an immense distance, from the true emptiness between galaxies. The signal was impossibly ancient. Its redshift indicated an origin billions of light-years away, reaching me from a time before Earth, before the Sun, perhaps even before our own galaxy had fully coalesced. Yet it was precise. It carried information. This wasn't a quasar, a pulsar, or any cosmic beacon I understood. This was deliberate, a place where nothing should exist. I traced the signal's trajectory. My hands trembled as I cross-referenced the coordinates with every known celestial object. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Just the black, featureless canvas of intergalactic space. My skin prickled. The air felt heavy, suddenly charged with an unseen presence. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the glass. The sequence of pulses scrolled endlessly, each one a tiny, perfect, impossible beat. What could create such a thing, and why was it only now, after billions of years, reaching me? The receiver hummed, a low, steady thrum against the pervasive quiet of my isolated station. I had checked everything, every circuit, every antenna alignment. The instruments were precise, calibrated to the nanometer. There was no error in my methodology. The signal, therefore, was real. That fact alone felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, a cold hand tightening around my throat. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I adjusted the filters. Outside, the perpetual gray twilight of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, bled into genuine night. I could just make out the distant, rhythmic flash of the lighthouse, a lonely sentinel against the vast, indifferent ocean. The smell of salt and damp earth seeped through the ventilation, mingling with the metallic tang of ozone from my equipment. I was alone, surrounded by machines that whispered secrets from beyond the stars and the ancient, unchanging rhythm of the tide. I started with the basics, feeding the raw data into spectral analyzers, hoping for a familiar signature. Pulsars, quasars, the thermal noise of galactic dust, these were the languages I understood. But what flickered across my screens was alien. It wasn't random noise, nor was it the chaotic burst of a dying star. It was structured, days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My desk became a landscape of crumpled paper, discarded coffee mugs, and the constant glow of monitors. My eyes burned, gritty and dry. The taste of stale coffee clung to my tongue. All that mattered was the signal. I tried every known method of deconvolution, every algorithm designed to strip away noise and reveal underlying information. I looked for mathematical sequences, prime numbers, Fibonacci spirals, anything that might signify intelligent design. Nothing. The patterns were there, undeniable, but they refused to conform to any logical framework I possessed. Then a flicker, a subtle periodicity I'd almost missed, buried deep within the chaos. It wasn't a simple repetition, but a repetition of variance. A pattern where the deviation itself was part of the design. It was like listening to a piece of music where every note was unique, yet the overall composition was perfectly symmetrical. My breath hitched. This wasn't merely complex, it was impossibly so. I leaned closer to the monitor, my face inches from the glowing pixels. A headache, dull and insistent, throbbed behind my eyes. I could feel the blood pulsing in my temples. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken implications. The signal wasn't just defying known physics, it was toying with it. It implied a logic that twisted the very fabric of expectation, an architecture built from paradox. The patterns shifted, coalescing into something I couldn't quite grasp, but which resonated with an unsettling sense of purpose. It wasn't a message I could read, but an undeniable presence I could feel. It was like looking at a vast, intricate tapestry woven from threads that didn't exist, depicting scenes that defied description. Each thread, each knot, each impossible color spoke of an intelligence so profound, so utterly other, that it made my own mind feel like a child scribbling. My hands, though still trembling, moved with renewed urgency. I fed segments of the signal into visualization software, hoping a graphical representation might reveal what raw data obscured. The results were not graphs or charts, but swirling, fractal geometries that pulsed with an unnatural light. They were beautiful in a terrifying, inhuman way, like looking into the perfect, crystalline structure of a nightmare. These weren't just patterns, they were signatures. Of what? I didn't know, but the sheer, layered complexity, the self-referential nature of the data, screamed of deliberate construction. It was a communication, yes, but one not meant for human ears or minds. It felt less like a message and more like an imprint, a cosmic echo of something that had thought and existed on a scale I couldn't begin to comprehend. This wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion. My ordered world, built on predictable laws and observable phenomena, was cracking. What kind of entity could weave such intricate, paradoxical meaning from the very emptiness between galaxies? What did it want? The hum of the receiver still echoed in my ears, a phantom vibration against the silence of my small station, even after I had powered it down. It was a sound that had shattered my world, a structured pattern from the intergalactic void, ancient beyond comprehension. My instruments, precise to the nanometer, insisted on its reality. My mind, however, rebelled. This wasn't just a signal. It was a message, or perhaps a signature, of something that defied every known law. I needed more than data. I needed context. My search led me away from the sterile glow of my screens, away from the logical progression of astrophysics. I drove for days, the landscape blurring from arid plains to rolling hills, then finally, to the jagged embrace of a coastline. My destination was a name whispered in obscure academic circles, an antiquarian known for collecting more than just old books, a curator of forgotten lore. The journey itself felt like a descent, leaving behind the clean lines of scientific inquiry for something altogether murkier. I found the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, nestled in a cove, a collection of weather-beaten stone houses clinging to the cliffs like barnacles. The wind carried the sharp tang of brine and decaying fish, a smell that clung to everything. Fishing boats, painted in faded primary colors, bobbed in the choppy harbor, their masts swaying with a mournful creak. The narrow, cobbled lanes were slick with perpetual damp. Few people were out, but those I saw: a grizzled fisherman mending nets. A stooped woman carrying a basket watched me with eyes that seemed too old, too knowing. They didn't smile. I felt an intruder, an alien presence in a place untouched by the rapid churn of the outside world. The antiquarian's dwelling was easy to spot, even without directions. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of mildewed paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, hung in the air around it. I knocked on the heavy oak door. The sound echoed, swallowed by the sea wind. The man who emerged was thin, his frame stooped, but his eyes, glinting behind thick spectacles, were unnervingly alert. He wore a patched tweed jacket that seemed as ancient as his dwelling. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, etched deep by time and perhaps by a lifetime of peering into forgotten secrets. I introduced myself, trying to keep my voice steady, to sound like a legitimate researcher, not a man chasing ghosts. I spoke vaguely about patterns, ancient cosmologies, structures that predated human understanding. I could not mention the signal, not yet. He listened, his head cocked slightly, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. "So you seek the deeper patterns, do you?" He rasped, the smile widening slightly. "Few come looking for those." The interior of the dwelling was a labyrinth of towering bookshelves, crammed with volumes of every size and age. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grime-streaked windows. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of aged paper, leather, and something undefinable, something that spoke of forgotten epochs. Each step I took on the creaking floorboards felt like an intrusion. The antiquarian led me deeper, through narrow passages flanked by precariously stacked tomes, past displays of strange, unidentifiable artifacts wrapped in yellowed cloth. My collection is, knowledge, after all, is a double-edged blade. I spent hours, guided by his occasional cryptic suggestions, sifting through the layers of accumulated history. My fingers grew grimy with dust, my eyes strained in the dim light. I found treatises on arcane astrology, fragmented accounts of pre-Atlantean civilizations, speculative cosmographies from forgotten cults. None of it felt right. My scientific mind yearned for order, for a direct correlation, but these were just myths, stories woven by ancient fears. Frustration began to prickle at me. Was I deluding myself? Had the signal, for all its undeniable reality, simply driven me to chase phantoms? Human. He moved with surprising agility for his age, pulling a heavy, bound volume from a shelf so high I hadn't even noticed it. It had no title, only a series of deeply carved, alien symbols that seemed to writhe in the poor light. He laid it open on a sturdy, dust-caked table. The pages, thick and brittle, were covered in a script I didn't recognize, interspersed with intricate, unsettling diagrams. My eyes fell upon one particular drawing. It was a complex interlocking pattern, a geometric nightmare of angles and curves that seemed to fold in upon itself, hinting at dimensions beyond my grasp. It was not symmetrical in any earthly sense, yet it possessed a profound internal coherence. My breath hitched. I pulled out my tablet, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I brought up the visual representation of the signal data, the intricate wave patterns, the frequency modulations translated into a three-dimensional model I had painstakingly constructed. I overlaid it, mentally at first, then physically adjusting the tablet's angle, trying to deny what my eyes were screaming at me. The correlation was impossible. Every curve, every impossible angle, every subtle shift in the archaic symbols corresponded with a nuance in my data. It wasn't an approximation, it was a match. My hands began to tremble. This wasn't a myth, this was a record, a blueprint. The text, translated by the antiquarian's quiet murmurs, described a cosmic geometry that was not merely ancient but fundamental. It was a description of the signal's source, its purpose. It was a warning. What I have found, it is not merely a signal. It is a presence, and it is waking. My scientific discovery, my greatest triumph, had just become my deepest horror. The universe was not empty. It was occupied by something that saw our reality as a flawed construct, something that could unravel the very threads of existence. What had I truly found, and what would it do now that I had acknowledged its impossible design? The sea wind, thick with salt and the sharp tang of drying fish, was supposed to be a balm. I had come to this coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, seeking a quiet corner to process the impossible truth I had unearthed. My small rented room, above a chandlery that smelled perpetually of tar and brine, offered a single window overlooking the slate-gray waters. Here, I thought, the sheer, indifferent expanse of the ocean might dwarf the cosmic horror I carried within me. I was wrong. My mornings had settled into a fragile routine. Wake before dawn, watch the fishing boats motor out, make a strong, bitter coffee. Today, the ritual offered no solace. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the dark liquid into my favorite ceramic mug, a gift from a former colleague, decorated with a faded, intricate pattern of celestial bodies. I set it on the scarred wooden table beside my notes, then turned to pull down the worn blinds, shielding my eyes from the raw, rising sun. When I turned back, the mug was not where I had left it. It had shifted, perhaps an inch to the left, nestled closer to the edge of the table than I remembered. A small detail easily dismissed. Had I nudged it? My memory felt solid. I was certain I'd placed it squarely in the center. I picked it up, feeling the cool ceramic against my fingers, and set it back precisely where it belonged. The coffee steam curled, briefly distorting the air above it. My breath caught, a shallow hitch in my chest. This was stress, I told myself. Lack of sleep, the sheer magnitude of what I had learned. Later, as I walked the narrow, cobbled lanes of the village, the air was heavy with the cries of gulls and the rhythmic thud of waves against the seawall. The older residents, bundled in rough wool sweaters, nodded curtly as I passed, their eyes ancient and knowing. I tried to focus on the comforting normalcy of it all, the nets drying on the docks, the dull clatter from the blacksmith's forge, the smell of wood smoke from a chimney. But a cold unease had begun to seep into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. I stopped by the small general store, its windows fogged with damp and age, to buy a loaf of bread. As I reached for the handle of the battered wooden door, the frame seemed to buckle. Not physically, not a creak or a groan, but visually. For a fraction of a second, the sturdy rectangle of the doorframe warped, twisting inwards at an impossible angle, its lines refusing to meet correctly. It was like staring at a poorly rendered drawing, a perspective gone fundamentally wrong. My stomach lurched. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, the door was perfectly normal, solid, and unyielding. The sensation lingered, though, a phantom ache behind my eyes, a subtle wrongness that made my skin prickle. They was my sight failing. They was I simply exhausted. That evening, the first proper rain of the season lashed against my window panes, a drumming rhythm that usually lulled me into a deep sleep. Tonight, it only amplified my agitation. I tried to read, to immerse myself in the familiar comfort of text, but the words swam, refusing to settle. Sleep, when it finally came, was a descent into a landscape of profound disquiet. It wasn't a dream in the conventional sense, not a narrative I could recall or recount. It was a sensation, a vivid, overwhelming impression of being immersed in pure, unadulterated correction. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a stretching in the architecture of my own thoughts. Shapes that defied Euclidean geometry flickered at the periphery of my mind's eye. Lines that curved back upon themselves, planes that intersected at more than 90 degrees, volumes that contained less space than their exteriors suggested. I felt, rather than saw, intricate frameworks being disassembled, then reassembled in ways that were utterly alien, yet somehow right to the dream self that experienced them. It was not violent, but surgical, precise, and horrifying in its implication. I was a page being rewritten, my own internal logic subject to an unseen editor. A silent scream tore through my throat, but no sound escaped my lips in the dream. It was not my dream. It was something else, something vast and indifferent, using my mind as a canvas, or perhaps a crucible. The rain still hammered against the glass, but the world felt different. The air in the room seemed heavier, charged with an invisible tension. My eyes darted around the familiar room, searching for any lingering trace of the impossible geometries, of the sensation of being undone. Nothing. The walls were solid, the furniture mundane. Yet the feeling of being touched, of having my very perception altered, persisted. The dreams were no longer mere nightmares. They were direct transmissions, intrusions into the most private sanctuary of my being. What was happening to me? And what would it rewrite next? My small rented room, above a chandlery that smelled perpetually of hemp, brine, and ancient wood, offered little solace. The impossible signal, that structured whisper from the void between galaxies, had burned itself into my waking thoughts and haunted my dreams. It was a wound in reality, and I, Marcus, was the only one who had seen it bleed. I had spent days sifting through forgotten journals, obscure scientific papers, and half-mad historical accounts, searching for anything that might echo what I had found. My search had led me to the name of an old academic, once brilliant, now a ghost. Whispers around the village docks, hushed conversations between fishermen mending nets, painted a picture of a mind fractured by forbidden knowledge. They called the academic the hermit, or the one who saw too much. No one would give me directions directly. The climb was steep, the path overgrown with thorny bushes that snagged my trousers. The wind here was a constant, mournful wail, whipping strands of my hair across my face and stinging my eyes with salt. At the crest, nestled precariously close to the eroding cliff edge, stood a squat, stone dwelling. A rusted gate hung half open, groaning softly in the wind. No garden remained, only a patch of scraggly weeds battling the persistent gales. I pushed the gate open. The hinges shrieked, a sound like tearing fabric. The air here was heavy, not just with sea salt, but with something else, a faint, acrid smell I couldn't place, like burnt paper and something metallic. No answer. After a long moment, a shuffling sound came from within, slow and deliberate. A small wooden peephole slid open with a rasp. A single, rheumy eye, magnified and distorted, peered out at me. It was an eye that had seen too much indeed. It held a deep, unsettling weariness, a knowledge that weighed it down. "What do I want?" A voice rasped, thin as dried leaves. "My name is Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady against the wind. "I'm here about certain patterns, anomalies." The peephole slammed shut. I thought I had been dismissed, but then, with a series of groans and clicks, the heavy door slowly opened, revealing a gaunt figure. The academic was stooped, their frame swallowed by an oversized, threadbare wool cardigan. Wisps of white hair, unkempt and tangled, framed a face etched with deep lines, like a map of endless worry. Their eyes, though bloodshot and watery, still held that terrifying intensity I had glimpsed through the peephole. They led me into a room choked with books, papers, and peculiar instruments I didn't recognize. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows. Every surface was piled high, leaving only narrow paths. I felt a prickle on my skin, an instinctual recoil from the sheer accumulation of forgotten knowledge. "I've detected a signal," I began, choosing my words carefully, avoiding specifics. Structured, ancient beyond comprehension, it defies all known physics. The academic stopped, turning slowly to face me. A tremor ran through their hands, which clutched a sheaf of brittle, yellowed papers. Between galaxies, you say, not from within our own, not from a star or a pulsar or a black hole. Their voice dropped, becoming unnervingly clear, shedding its former frailty. You've looked where you shouldn't have, Marcus. Our laws, our physics, our very understanding of existence. They are but a thin veil, the academic rasped, stepping closer. The metallic smell intensified, making my nostrils sting. There are mechanisms, entities if you must call them that, not living in any way we comprehend. Not flesh, not energy, not even thought. They are principles, fundamental corrections. Their gaze was fixed on some point beyond me, beyond the room, perhaps beyond the very walls of reality. They exist in the interstices, in the between. They are the silent architects, the quiet editors of reality. When something strays too far, when a pattern becomes too discordant, when a law is violated, they correct it, and the correction is absolute. I could feel my heart beginning to thrum, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. A correction, they strip away what does not fit, they unravel the threads. Sanity is the first casualty, Marcus. Perception is the second, then existence itself. Not destruction, not annihilation, but a return to a fundamental, inert state, a resonance, a side effect of their work. They are not malevolent, Marcus. They are simply corrective. The room seemed to press in, the piles of books like silent witnesses to an ancient, ongoing horror. What happens, I managed to choke out, my throat suddenly dry, if one listens too long? The academic's face twisted into a grimace that might have been a smile. Your mind, your very being, will be realigned. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will understand, and understanding is the end. They slumped against a teetering stack of books, their energy seemingly drained. The intense focus left their eyes, replaced by that distant, weary gaze once more. The room fell silent, save for the persistent wail of the wind outside, a mournful dirge for something lost, or something yet to be unmade. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the academic's words echoing in the cavern of my skull. But what truly waited for me beyond that threshold? The persistent wail of the wind outside the old stone cottage seemed to have finally lulled my colleague into a weary quiet. They had slumped against the teetering stack of books, their energy seemingly drained, the intense focus leaving their eyes. Now, only that distant, weary gaze remained, fixed on some unseen point beyond the rain-streaked window. The room had fallen silent, save for the mournful dirge of the gale, a sound I'd grown accustomed to in this isolated coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced. I watched them for a long moment, the flickering lamplight casting deep shadows across their face, making the lines of exhaustion seem like ancient carvings. What had they seen in the raw data? The patterns I'd only begun to grasp. A shiver traced its way up my spine, not from the chill of the sea air seeping through the gaps in the window frame, but from a deeper, colder place. Eventually, they pushed themselves up, a low groan escaping their lips, and shuffled out without a word, leaving me alone with the hum of my machinery and the vast, indifferent ocean. I turned back to the console, the glow of the screens a stark contrast to the gloom of the room. The air here always carried the tang of salt and decay, a constant reminder of the ocean's ceaseless churn, its ancient rhythms. The village itself, with its weathered boats hauled onto the shingle and its stoic, quiet inhabitants, felt like a place outside of time, clinging to traditions as old as the waves themselves. It was the perfect refuge, I had thought, for a mind grappling with something impossibly ancient. My fingers, still trembling slightly from the lingering tension of the past hours, moved over the controls. The signal. I had to understand. Was I truly alone in this pursuit, or was something else observing me too, through the static and the stars? The initial decoding had been an intellectual triumph, a testament to the universal laws of mathematics and physics. But as I delved deeper, past the surface layers of elegant prime numbers and intricate fractal geometries, something shifted. The patterns began to defy conventional logic. They weren't merely complex, they were adaptive. The signal seemed to respond to my analytical probes, subtly altering its structure, as if anticipating my next move, guiding my focus. It was no longer just data. It was a conversation, a dialogue without words. I hunched closer, my breath fogging the screen, straining to perceive the nuance. The hum of the processor became a low thrum against my ribs, a sensation that permeated my very bones. This wasn't just information being transmitted. It was meaning being conveyed directly, intimately. It wasn't a sound, not in the way we understand it. Yet I perceived it as a song, a vast, intricate melody woven from existence itself, resonating not in my ears but directly within the chambers of my mind. It bypassed my auditory cortex, settling instead into a deeper, more primal part of my consciousness. Each note was a concept, each chord a philosophy, layered and interwoven with an impossible density. The sheer antiquity of it pressed down on me, a crushing weight of ages that made my own existence feel like a fleeting spark against an eternal night. What was this song doing to my mind, and could I truly understand it without breaking? It spoke of correction, of recalibration, not of flaws in its own design, but in the fundamental constants of our reality. It saw existence not as a marvel, but as an error requiring rectification. The song wasn't malicious. It was something far more terrifying, impersonal. It was the gentle, inevitable sweep of a broom across a dusty floor, and we were the dust. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I felt a desperate, irrational urge to scream, but no sound would come. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very atoms around me were resisting my breath. This entity, this architect of oblivion, was speaking directly to me, revealing its horrifying intent. Why me? And what will happen when I fully comprehend its terrible design? Now, only that distant, weary gaze remained fixed, on nothing I could discern. A faint tremor ran through their hand, clenching and unclenching, a silent testament to the strain. I watched the movement, a strange sense of relief washing over me, quickly followed by a colder, sharper apprehension. Had they truly found some peace, or was this merely a new, more profound stillness? The air in the room, thick with the scent of aged paper and salt from the nearby ocean, felt heavy, almost viscous. My own exhaustion was a dull ache behind my eyes, a constant pressure that made every thought feel like pushing through mud. I hadn't slept properly in days, not since the signal had become an incessant hum in the back of my skull, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very bone. I tried to focus on the colleague, on their unmoving form, seeking some anchor in the strange calm that had settled. But their silence stretched, an unnatural chasm in the small, creaking room, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see a shadow cast by the sputtering oil lamp, but there was nothing. Just the rough-hewn stone wall, scarred with time and moisture. Yet the sensation lingered, a fleeting impression of something moving where nothing should have been. My pulse quickened, a nervous flutter I tried to ignore. It was just fatigue, I told myself, the brain playing tricks in the twilight hours of an overworked mind. This coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, held a quiet that was both soothing and unnerving, especially when the wind howled like a mournful spirit. I shifted, the old wooden chair groaning beneath me. The sound seemed to ripple, distorting, elongating into a low, guttural moan that wasn't the chair at all. It was too deep, too resonant. I gripped the armrests, gripped tight, straining to hear it again, but it was gone, swallowed by the ceaseless moan of the actual wind. My breath hitched. Was I truly hearing things, or was the signal's influence beginning to manifest in ways I couldn't control? The thought sent a cold tendril of fear down my spine. My gaze drifted back to my colleague. Their head was still resting against the precarious stack of books, their eyes wide and unblinking. I noticed then a subtle distortion around the edges of their face. The lamplight, instead of illuminating their features evenly, seemed to bend around them, creating a faint, shimmering halo that wasn't quite right. Their skin, usually pale, now held a faint, almost translucent quality as if the very light passed through them. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard. When I looked again, the effect was lessened but not entirely gone. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer remained. A new thought, insidious and unwelcome, began to worm its way into my mind. Had they been like this for a while? Had I been so lost in my own thoughts, so consumed by the signal that I hadn't noticed their slow, quiet unraveling? The possibility was a bitter taste in my mouth, metallic and sharp. I leaned forward, my voice a rasp. "Are you all right?" No response, only the distant, unwavering stare. A profound unease, a fear that moving them might shatter whatever fragile state they were in, or worse, reveal something I wasn't prepared to see. The coastal fishing village, with its ancient stones and even older traditions, felt like a cage at that moment, holding us both captive to something unseen. The low hum in my head intensified, growing from a distant vibration to a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that throbbed in time with my racing heart. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples, a frantic drumbeat. I could almost feel the signal, not just hear it, but feel its presence, a vast, indifferent weight pressing down on the cottage, on us. The corners of the room stretched, elongated, twisting into shapes that defied the laws of perspective. The stack of books behind my colleague seemed to sway, not from an earthquake, but as if the very air around them was warping, undulating like water. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't imagination. This was something else. I tried to speak, but my throat was suddenly dry, constricted. My gaze was drawn back to my colleague, to their unmoving form. And then I saw it, or thought I saw it. A faint, almost translucent filament, like a strand of spider silk, seemed to extend from their temple, shimmering in the distorted lamplight, stretching towards the wall, towards the very fabric of the room. It pulsed faintly, a barely visible thread of light connecting them to. What? My breath caught. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them, trying to banish the image, to force my mind back to a tangible, understandable reality. This was a trick, a hallucination, a product of my frayed nerves and sleep deprivation. It had to be. When I opened my eyes again, the filament was gone. My colleague remained slumped, their gaze fixed, perhaps a millimeter to the left of where it had been before, or had it always been there? My memories, usually so precise, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. What else was my mind now capable of inventing? The stranger remained where I had left them, a silent, unmoving statue against the peeling wallpaper of the small, cramped room. Their eyes, wide and fixed on some unseen point beyond the grimy window, held a depth of emptiness that chilled me more profoundly than any icy wind. I had tried to speak, to coax a word, a gesture, anything that might explain the profound change that had come over them, but the silence had only deepened, pressing in on me like a physical weight. What had they seen? What had they known that rendered them so utterly absent? The faint scent of brine and damp wood, usually comforting in this coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, now seemed tainted, carrying a subtle metallic tang I couldn't place. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I gathered my portable sensor array. I couldn't stay here, not while the world outside continued its slow, terrifying unraveling. I had to know what the signal was doing, what it truly meant. Leaving them felt like a betrayal and abandonment, but the alternative was to succumb to the same paralysis that gripped them. I took one last look, a silent promise to return, though to what, I couldn't say. The question of their fate gnawed at me, a sharp tooth in my mind. Stepping out into the narrow, cobbled lane, the usual cacophony of the village was muted. The cries of gulls seemed distant, muffled by a pervasive stillness that had settled over the rooftops. The air, despite the ocean's proximity, felt strangely dry, tasting not of salt but of something akin to ozone, faint but persistent. My boots crunched on the damp stones, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. The weathered facades of the houses, usually a tapestry of faded blues and greens, seemed to press in, their windows like vacant eyes. A few fishing boats bobbed listlessly in the harbor, their masts swaying with an odd, jerky rhythm, not quite in sync with the gentle swell of the water. Had the tide always moved with such an uneven pulse? I pulled the small, ruggedized tablet from my satchel, its screen a faint glow in the overcast morning. The data streams, usually a chaotic dance of cosmic background radiation and stellar emissions, were now punctuated by increasingly frequent, sharp spikes. Not just noise, but patterns within the noise, like echoes from a broken bell. These weren't just fluctuations in the signal, they were distortions in the very fabric of local space-time. The gravitational variance, usually a flat line, now jaggedly leaped, then plummeted, then normalized, all within a span of seconds. It was like the Earth was breathing erratically. What invisible hand was clenching the very air around me? My breath hitched in my throat. I remembered the sensation, faint at first, a subtle shift in my own weight, like standing on a boat that unexpectedly dipped and then recovered. I had dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the mind, but the tablet didn't lie. The anomalies were real, growing in intensity and frequency. The entity wasn't merely broadcasting its incomprehensible message across light years. It was here, or rather, its influence was. The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was like sensing the tremor of a distant, impossibly large footfall. I hurried towards the old lighthouse, my makeshift observation post. The climb up the winding stone steps was usually a familiar routine, but today, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the pull of gravity itself was capricious. My knees ached, my lungs burned, and not just from exertion. When I finally reached the top, the panoramic view of the churning gray sea and the huddled village below was strangely distorted. The horizon, usually a clean line, wavered, shimmering as if seen through heated air, yet the temperature was dropping. The gulls, usually circling, were absent. The silence was absolute, save for the hollow groan of the wind through the lamp house. What was happening to the very light of the world? The main console, a jumble of repurposed scientific instruments and custom-built receivers, sprang to life with a familiar hum, though even that sound seemed to vibrate with an unnatural frequency. I connected the portable array, watching the data flood the main screens. The spikes were everywhere now, a chaotic symphony of impossible physics. Gravitational fields fluctuating wildly, atmospheric pressure dropping, and then spiking, localized distortions in the electromagnetic spectrum that shouldn't exist. My eyes darted across the readouts, trying to make sense of the madness. The entity wasn't just transmitting, it was approaching. Or perhaps its influence was spreading, rippling outwards from some unseen focal point, warping the very laws of reality as it expanded. The signal, that ancient, structured hum, was no longer a distant beacon. It was the low thrum of an immense, invisible engine drawing nearer. My mind raced, trying to grasp the impossible. How could something so vast, so ancient, so utterly alien manifest such profound physical changes? My scientific training screamed in protest, but the data was undeniable. The impossible was happening. A sudden jarring lurch threw me against the console. The entire lighthouse shuddered, a deep, resonant groan echoing through the stone. For a terrifying second, the floor beneath my feet felt like rubber, and my stomach dropped as if I'd fallen from a great height. Then just as suddenly, it stabilized. The screens flickered, then returned, displaying even more violent spikes. I clutched the edge of the console, my grip tight. There was the world itself groaning under an unbearable weight. The horizon was now visibly warped, a shimmering, indistinct line where sky met sea. The fishing boats in the harbor below, previously bobbing listlessly, now seemed to hang suspended for a fraction of a second before dropping with an unnatural splash. The world was not merely changing, it was being rearranged. What would be left when the entity finally arrived? I had tried to speak, but the words had caught in my throat, tangled with a fear that had no name, only a vast, cold presence. Now the memory of those eyes clung to me, a persistent frost on my thoughts, even as I stumbled out into the salt-laced air of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced. The fog, thick and damp, swallowed the distant wail of a boy, muffling the world. I clenched my fists, the rough wool of my sweater scratching against my skin. There was no time for paralysis, no room for the quiet horror that had been gnawing at me. The signal, the entity, the unraveling fabric of reality. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I had to make someone else see it too. My first thought was Marcus, a former colleague whose mind, though perhaps too conventional, was sharp enough to grasp the implications, given the right data. I found the village's only public telephone booth near the docks, a rusted metal relic smelling of stale cigarettes and brine. The dial tone, when it finally warbled to life, sounded impossibly fragile, a thin thread connecting me to a world I was rapidly losing touch with. I punched in Marcus's direct line, the numbers a desperate prayer. The ringing echoed in my ear, each pulse a hammer blow against my resolve. Finally, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Professor Marcus's office. How may I direct your call?" "It's Marcus," I blurted, my voice hoarse. "Tell him it's me. Tell him I have to speak to him. It's urgent, catastrophic." A pause, a faint rustle of papers. "One moment, please." The line went silent, stretching like a rubber band. When Marcus's voice finally came through, it was guarded, tinged with an uncomfortable politeness. "Marcus, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. How are you?" "How am I?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I'm the only one who knows what's coming, Marcus. The signal, it's not just ancient, it's a blueprint, a correction, it's unraveling everything. The laws, the constants, it's not just theory anymore. I've seen the effects." Then Marcus spoke, his voice slow, measured, almost soothing. "Marcus, I understand I've been under immense pressure. This project, it's consuming. Perhaps I need to step away from the data for a while. Get some rest." I sound overwrought. "Overwrought," I hissed, clutching the receiver tighter. "The universe is coming undone, and I think I'm overwrought. I have the evidence. The anomalies, the shifts in the baseline cosmic radiation, they're not noise, they're signatures. The stranger, their eyes. They've seen it too, they know." Another sigh, heavier this time. "Marcus, with all due respect, what I read describing sounds, highly speculative, and frankly a little unhinged. Unraveling everything, correction. These are not scientific terms, and a stranger." His voice hardened slightly, a subtle shift from concern to professional dismissal. "We've reviewed my preliminary findings. Interesting, yes, but nothing that warrants this kind of alarmism. We're concerned about you, Marcus, my well-being. My well-being won't matter when reality itself is rewritten." I yelled, my voice cracking. "I have to listen. It's acting." "I think," Marcus interjected, his voice firm, "we should perhaps arrange for I to take a sabbatical, a proper break, away from everything." What did he truly believe was happening to me? My hands were shaking, the coins I still held digging into my palm. The salt spray stung my face, but I barely felt it, dismissed. As delusion, as a breakdown. The academic community, my colleagues, the very people who should have understood, had closed ranks. I was an anomaly, a variable to be removed. Desperation clawed at me. If not them, then who? The local authorities. Perhaps they wouldn't understand the astrophysics, but they would understand danger, impending catastrophe. I stumbled through the narrow, winding lanes of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, towards the small stone building that served as the local constabulary. The air here was heavy with the scent of drying fishnets and damp earth, a primal smell that felt ironically grounding, yet utterly irrelevant to the cosmic horror I carried. The constable, a broad-shouldered man with hands like gnarled oak, listened to me with a patient, unblinking stare. I laid out my case, simplified, stripped of its most complex scientific terms. I spoke of the signal, the growing sense of wrongness, the way the very fabric of existence felt thin, stretched. I even mentioned the stranger, their vacant eyes, the quiet despair I had witnessed. He leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, his gaze unwavering but utterly uncomprehending. "So you're saying," he rumbled, his voice slow and deliberate, "that there's something out there, in the sky, and it's going to change the world." "Not just change it," I insisted, leaning forward, my voice urgent. unmake it, reorder it into something we can't possibly conceive, and it's happening now. He scratched his chin, a sound like sandpaper. And you, scientist from far away, you've seen this, heard it. He looked at my disheveled appearance, my bloodshot eyes, the tremor that ran through my hands. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, quickly suppressed. Mr. Marcus, this village has seen its share of strange things. Old stories, the sea playing tricks on men's minds, but what you're describing, it sounds like a bad dream, or perhaps a man who's been working too hard, alone for too long. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Perhaps a good meal, a long night's sleep. The sea can be a powerful thing, Mr. Marcus. It can make a man see things, feel things. He offered me a cup of lukewarm tea, his gesture kind but dismissive. We'll keep an eye out for anything unusual, but I think for now you should try to rest. Rest. The word felt like a mockery. The sea, a powerful thing. He had no idea. He saw only a man unraveling, not the unraveling of everything. As I walked back into the pervasive fog, the weight of their disbelief pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden. I was alone. Utterly, terribly alone. The cosmic entity continued its silent work, and humanity remained oblivious, wrapped in its fragile cocoon of normalcy. What hope could there be when the warnings went unheard, swallowed by the comfortable ignorance of a world too busy to look up? The fog pressed in, a damp, gray blanket muffling the world. Each step I took on the cobblestones of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, felt heavy, weighted by the scorn of the council. Their dismissal was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. I had tried to warn them. I had tried to explain. But how do I articulate the dissolution of reality to minds tethered so firmly to its supposed permanence? The salty air tasted of brine and something else, something acrid and strange, like ozone after a distant, silent lightning strike. My breath plumed in the chill. I pulled my jacket tighter, the coarse wool doing little to ward off the pervasive dampness that seemed to seep into my bones. The fishing boats, usually a jumble of bright primary colors, were muted, their hulls vague shapes swallowed by the swirling mist. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and deduction, felt like a sieve. I saw only a man unraveling, not the unraveling of everything. Was I the only one who could see the threads fraying? I shivered, though not from the temperature. It was a tremor that started deep within my chest, vibrating through my ribs. As I passed the village square, where the stone monument to a forgotten fisherman usually stood proud and angular, I faltered. The monument was there, yes, but something about its silhouette felt wrong. The angles, once sharp and defined, now seemed softer, blunted, as if the very stone had begun to flow, like wax cooling too slowly. I stopped, staring, my eyes straining in the gloom. The edges of the carved sails on the monument's base curved inward, defying the rigid geometry of stone. My breath hitched. Was this the beginning? I walked on, my pace quickening, a frantic energy seizing me. The familiar path to the old lighthouse, usually a straight shot along the uneven cliff edge, now felt subtly altered. The ground under my feet seemed to tilt in ways that didn't quite align with the visual horizon. My equilibrium wavered. A distant bell from the village church chimed. One stroke. It was noon. It was always noon. But the chimes were haphazard, broken like a clock skipping beats. The sound scraped against my nerves, a discordant melody in the quiet village. What was happening to the very passage of time? Further along, near the docks, a cluster of villagers huddled, their voices hushed, laced with a palpable fear. A fisherman, his weathered face etched with worry, pointed out to sea. His hand trembled. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing but the boundless gray expanse where the water met the sky. Yet the group's agitation was undeniable. A woman, clutching a shawl tightly around her, began to weep, soft, broken sounds that were quickly shushed by an older man with kind, tired eyes. Their fear was not of the mundane, of a storm or a bad catch. This was deeper. What sight had so unnerved them in the vast emptiness of the ocean? Gone. Another, younger, with bright darting eyes, added, "The morning star. It was there, then it wasn't. No foghorn, no distress, just." The morning star was a familiar trawler, a sturdy vessel that had plied these waters for decades. I knew the captain, a gruff but reliable man, not prone to recklessness, not prone to vanishing without a trace. The others nodded grimly, their gazes sweeping the horizon as if the boat might reappear from the mist, whole and solid. But I knew better. This wasn't a wreck. This was an erasure. How many others had simply ceased to be? A faint, high-pitched whine started in my ears, a thin thread of sound that seemed to hum from the very air itself. It grew louder, a pressure building behind my eyes. My vision blurred at the edges, the familiar lines of the fishing shacks across the harbor seeming to ripple, to bend like heat haze. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The shacks were still there, but their roofs, once simple gabled structures, now boasted impossible angles, acute and obtuse vertices that couldn't exist on a single plane. They twisted, folding in on themselves, yet somehow remained upright, defying gravity and logic. My stomach churned. This was it, the impossible geometry. The entity was here. It was everywhere. The whine intensified, becoming a piercing shriek that threatened to split my skull. I stumbled, clutching my head, my knees threatening to give way. The ground beneath my feet felt like jelly, shifting and warping. The cobblestones, those solid, ancient stones, seemed to undulate, their surfaces flowing like viscous liquid. I could feel the texture change beneath my boots, from rough and firm to something slick and yielding, then back again in rapid, sickening succession. The world was melting. Around me, the villagers had fallen silent, their faces pale, eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on some unseen horror in the mist. What was left when the very ground betrayed I? I staggered toward the edge of the dock, drawn by a terrible fascination, unnaturally still. Its surface was no longer reflecting the gray sky, nor the muted lights of the village. Instead, it was a mirror, but a distorted one. It reflected a sky that was not gray, but a sickly, impossible chartreuse, streaked with veins of black that seemed to pulsate. And in the center of this twisted reflection, something began to form. A shape, not of the village, not of the sea, a perfect, impossibly complex polygon, its edges impossibly sharp, its facets shifting and rotating, defying the laws of optics, of space, of everything. It was growing, consuming the reflection, pushing back the familiar world. Was this the face of oblivion? I had failed. The salt-laden air, usually a bomb, now seemed to carry a metallic tang, an unidentifiable sharp edge that scraped at the back of my throat. My ears, once sensitive to the gentle lapping of waves against the ancient docks, now picked up a low, persistent hum beneath it all, a vibration that resonated in my very bones. I moved through the narrow lanes, past cottages with their weathered thatch roofs, past fishing nets hung out to dry like skeletal shrouds. The few residents I encountered averted their gazes, their faces etched with a wary suspicion that mirrored the council's disdain. They saw a madman, I knew, but I saw the truth, or at least the edges of it, shimmering and twisting at the periphery of their mundane lives. My hyper-awareness was a curse, a relentless flood of information that no ordinary mind was meant to process. Every rustle of dry reeds, every creak of a boat in its berth, every distant cry of a gull, it all seemed to carry an echo of the signal, a distorted harmonic that spoke of something vast and terrible. The old stone lighthouse, a sentinel against the churning gray sea, called to me. Its beam, usually a comforting sweep across the water, now seemed to carve out impossible angles in the fog, lines that defied perspective. I climbed the winding, worn steps, my fingers dragging across the cold, damp stone. Each turn brought a fresh wave of vertigo, not just from the height, but from the unsettling certainty that the very structure of the building was subtly wrong, its geometry subtly off. The steps were not quite equidistant. The curve of the wall was not truly uniform. My vision swam, registering minute distortions that no one else would ever perceive, yet they screamed at me, a silent, maddening chorus of imperfection. At the top, the air was thick with the brine and the insistent, low thrum. Outside, the fog was a living wall. I pressed my face against the cold glass, my breath misting the surface. And then I saw it. Not through the glass, not with my eyes, but through everything. The fog, the sea, the sky, they peeled back. They were just veils, thin and transparent. What lay beneath was not space, not stars, not the familiar velvet expanse I had studied for decades. It was a shifting tapestry of impossible forms, shapes that had no names, no analogues in any dimension I understood. It was not a single, definable shape, but a presence, an overwhelming, incomprehensible thing that permeated the very fabric of existence. My mind fractured, struggling to contain the vision. It was like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup or to explain a symphony with a single broken note. My knees buckled. I gripped the cold metal railing, my grip tight, my body trembling uncontrollably. My stomach churned, threatening to revolt against the impossible sight. It was not moving in any way I comprehended, yet it was acting. I saw not its limbs, for it had none, but its influence. It was like watching a sculptor work, but the clay was reality itself. It was smoothing out wrinkles in space, pinching off dimensions, correcting what it perceived as flaws in the fundamental laws. The slight distortions I'd noticed in the lighthouse, the metallic tang in the air, the off-kilter hum, they were not random anomalies. They were its touch, its subtle resculpting of the world around me. The signal, the impossible signal. It wasn't a message to us. It was a tool, a resonant frequency, a vibrational hum that was gently, patiently, retuning the universe. It was an entity of pure, alien logic, devoid of malice or benevolence, merely driven by an incomprehensible need to align reality with its own flawless, terrifying ideal. It was erasing the imperfections, the beautiful, chaotic randomness that defined our existence. I saw the past, present, and future of these alterations collapsing into a single, terrifying now. The stars I knew, the constellations I had mapped, they were flickering not like dying embers but like erased lines on a cosmic blueprint. The very concept of up and down felt suddenly arbitrary, subject to immediate revision. The air in my lungs felt thin, not due to lack of oxygen, but because the space it occupied felt less certain, less real. This was not a hostile invasion. It was a cosmic tidying, an incomprehensibly vast correction. We were not even dust motes in its path. We were a minor mathematical error, a deviation from the perfect equation it sought to establish. And it was fixing us. It was fixing everything. The world outside the glass, the familiar, comforting world of the coastal fishing village, old ways still practiced, seemed to shimmer, to lose its solidity. The houses, the boats, the very ground beneath them, they were all just temporary configurations, awaiting their inevitable reordering. My own body felt less like a solid form and more like a collection of hastily assembled particles, about to be dispersed by an unseen hand. What would be left when it was finished? What would a corrected existence even look like to a mind like mine? I had laid out the data, the impossible patterns, the undeniable implications of the signal, but they had merely shaken their heads, their faces etched with the deep lines of skepticism, and a patience I now recognized as a precursor to utter indifference. They called it a delusion, a scholar's fancy, too much time spent staring into the dark. The fishing boats, their hulls painted in faded, traditional colors, creaked against the docks. The air hung thick with the brine and the faint, sweet decay of seaweed. A lamp glowed faintly in the window of a small cottage, casting a halo into the dense vapor. Everything felt solid, real, stubbornly mundane, and yet the core of my being thrummed with a frantic internal vibration. I knew what was coming. I had seen the projections, interpreted the incomprehensible patterns woven into the fabric of the signal. It wasn't a threat of destruction, not in any way they understood. It was something far more insidious, a reordering, a correction. The village seemed to hold its breath too, an ancient sentinel against an encroaching tide. I scanned the obscured outlines of the houses, the nets strung out to dry, the weathered faces of the few villagers still awake, moving like specters through the gloom. They carried on oblivious. Their lives, their simple rituals, continued, utterly untouched by the cosmic horror that gnawed at my own sanity. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to force them to see what I saw in the numbers, what I felt in the marrow of my bones. What was I missing? Was I truly alone in this terrible knowing? A sound reached me then, faint at first, like the distant ringing of a bell, but wrong. It wasn't the chimes from the church, nor the buoys out in the harbor. It was a resonance that seemed to emanate from within the air itself, a low hum that vibrated in my teeth. The fog, already dense, began to shift, not with the wind, but with an internal motion, like a living thing stirring. Colors in the lamplit windows seemed to deepen, then fade, then flicker with hues I couldn't name. My eyes strained, trying to anchor themselves to the familiar, but the familiar was subtly warping. The cobblestones beneath my worn boots felt different, not rough, not smooth, but somehow indistinct, as if their very texture was undecided. I stopped, planting my feet, the hum growing louder, pressing against my eardrums. It wasn't painful, but it was insistent, a fundamental frequency. A dog barked, a sharp, clear sound, but the echo that followed it was stretched, distorted, like a sound heard underwater. Then the dog barked again, and this time the echo came before the bark. My stomach clenched. My mind struggled to reconcile what my eyes perceived, what my ears heard, what my skin felt. The world was fraying at the edges. The lamp in the cottage window pulsed, not with an electrical surge, but with a rhythmic, organic beat like a distant heart. I watched, paralyzed, as the outlines of the cottage softened, its sharp angles blurring into curves, then back again, faster and faster, until the structure seemed to breathe, a living, undefined form. A fisherman hauling his nets towards a shed paused. He stood absolutely still, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. The hum intensified, a silent scream that filled my skull. I saw his shadow lengthen, stretch impossibly, detaching itself from his feet and flowing like dark water over the cobblestones. It didn't just move, it changed, becoming a complex shifting pattern, then dissolving entirely, leaving no trace. The fisherman remained, a statue carved from a moment that refused to pass. My breath hitched. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. This was the correction. The sky above, previously an indistinguishable gray, began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. Stars, impossible to see through the fog, began to appear, not as pinpricks of light, but as vast, swirling nebulae, their colors shifting through impossible spectrums. They were too close. They were too bright. They were not stars I knew. The hum became a drone, a single, sustained note that vibrated through every cell of my body. My knees felt weak. How could this be happening? The transformation accelerated. The cobblestones under my feet lost their definition entirely, becoming a shimmering, fluid surface that reflected the impossible sky. The fishing boats at the dock began to elongate, their wooden hulls stretching like taffy, their masts twisting into intricate fractal spirals that reached towards the alien heavens. They didn't break, they reconfigured. The water in the harbor, once choppy and gray, became a perfectly still, obsidian mirror, reflecting a sky filled with geometries that defied Euclidean space. The air itself grew dense, viscous, and I found it difficult to draw a full breath. It wasn't a lack of oxygen. It was as if the concept of air was being rewritten, made unfamiliar. The villagers, the fisherman still hunched, began to slowly, imperceptibly flatten. His form compressed, his features smoothing out, his limbs receding into a two-dimensional plane. He wasn't collapsing, he was becoming something else, an intricate bas-relief pattern etched into the shifting ground. Other figures, those I had seen moving earlier, were undergoing similar silent transformations. They weren't screaming, they weren't struggling, they were simply reordering. Their skin took on the sheen of polished stone, their eyes becoming vast, unblinking surfaces that reflected the impossible light. They were no longer human. They were elements of a new tapestry, intricate and horrifyingly beautiful, woven into the fabric of this reimagined world. The cottages, too, began to ripple and fold in on themselves. their structures dissolving into complex interlocking forms that seemed to obey a different physics, a different logic. The warm glow from the lamp was gone, replaced by an internal luminescence that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a beat that was not of life, but of pure, unfeeling process. The smell of brine and decay vanished, replaced by an aroma that was both metallic and sweet, like ozone mixed with something utterly alien and inorganic. I felt my own form begin to waver, a faint tremor running through my hands, the edges of my vision blurring. My connection to the familiar, to the concrete reality I had always known, was slipping. The entire coastal fishing village old ways still practiced was no longer a village. It was a vast, sprawling installation of incomprehensible geometry, shifting light, and silent, reconfigured matter. The correction was complete, not with a bang, but with an agonizing, silent resculpting of existence. Humanity, Earth, all of it, had been absorbed, reordered into something utterly alien, indifferent, and vast. There was no pain, no struggle, just a silent, fundamental change. What was left of anything? I had laid out the data, the impossible patterns, the undeniable proof of the signal's intent, but they had only looked at me with eyes that saw a broken man, not a prophet of doom. Their faces, weathered by generations of sea spray and hard living, were impassive. The lead council elder, his beard a tangle of gray and salt, had simply waved a dismissive hand, muttering about omens and the folly of looking too far beyond the horizon. Had they truly understood nothing? I walked back towards the small, rented cottage, the air growing colder, sharper. The usual scent of brine and drying nets was now subtly different, tinged with something metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the storm. The narrow alleyways felt tighter, the ancient stones of the buildings leaning inward as if in silent judgment. I glanced at the sky, obscured by the insistent fog, and wondered if the veil was already thinning, if the entity's influence was already seeping into the very fabric of our atmosphere. What if I was too late, not just for them but for everything? It was the distinct feeling of being watched, not by the villagers but by something far vaster. My own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the damp walls. I stopped by a small, moss-covered fountain, its water usually a clear, babbling stream. Now the water was still, unnaturally so, reflecting the gray sky with a peculiar, oily sheen. Had the flow simply ceased, or had something altered its very nature? My breath hitched. The intricate carvings on the fountain's basin, depicting ancient sea creatures and swirling currents, seemed to subtly shift at the edges of my vision. A fin became a tendril, a scale a geometric impossibility. The carvings settled back into their familiar forms, but the impression of movement lingered, a phantom sensation. My head throbbed. Was it exhaustion, or was my mind already beginning to fray under the strain? I continued my walk, quickening my pace. The village, normally a picture of rustic charm, now felt like a stage set, its props subtly rearranged. A fisherman mending his nets by his cottage door paused, his hands still. He looked at his net, then at the sky, his brow furrowed in a way that spoke not of confusion but of a deep, unsettling recognition. His gaze swept over me, then past me, focusing on something unseen beyond the rooftops. What did he perceive that I could not yet fully grasp? Then the sounds began. Not loud, not sudden, but insidious. A faint hum like the deep resonant tone of a colossal bell, yet without the accompanying vibration. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the bone. It intensified, a pressure building in my skull behind my eyes. The air grew heavy, difficult to draw into my lungs. My chest felt tight, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my ribs. The cobblestones under my boots, once solid, now seemed to flex, giving way beneath my weight with a barely perceptible give. Was the ground itself becoming malleable. I stumbled, catching myself on the rough stone wall of a cottage. The wall felt wrong, its texture suddenly too smooth in places, then impossibly coarse in others, as if its very molecular structure was in flux. I stared at my hand, pressing against the stone. The lines on my palms seemed to writhe, elongating and shortening, my fingers appearing to stretch and contract for a terrifying instant. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a hallucination, this was fundamental. This was the correction. What would be left when the entity had finished reshaping reality to its incomprehensible design? The hum deepened, becoming a low, continuous thrum that vibrated through my teeth. The colors of the village began to bleed. The gray of the fog, the muted blues of the fishing boats, the earthy browns of the cottages, they all started to run into each other, forming swirling, indistinct patterns. It was like looking at a watercolor painting dissolving in water, but the water was the air itself, and the paint was the world. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the inability of my eyes to process the shifting spectrum. My determination, once a burning ember, now felt like a flickering match in a hurricane. How could I fight something that rewrote the very rules of perception? I saw the fisherman again, still by his door, but he was no longer mending nets. He stood utterly still, his head tilted upwards, his mouth slightly agape. As I watched, a section of his face just above his left eye seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The skin stretched thin, then snapped back, leaving behind a subtle distortion, a faint, iridescent shimmer where his brow had been. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He just stood there watching the sky becoming part of the tableau. Was he already lost, or had he simply accepted the inevitable? The ground beneath my feet gave a more pronounced lurch. I fell to my knees, scraping my palms on what felt like shifting sand, though I knew it was solid stone moments before. The hum was now a roar, a silent, internal thunder that threatened to burst my eardrums. The air crackled with an unseen energy, tasting of ozone and something else, something ancient and sterile. The buildings around me began to melt, not into liquid but into impossible geometries. Walls flowed into roofs, corners softened into curves that defied Euclidean space. The very concept of up and down lost meaning. My stomach churned, my sense of balance utterly obliterated. What was solid? What was real? I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt heavy, disconnected. The world was a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shifting forms. I saw the lead council elder in the distance, standing in the middle of what had been the village square. His form was no longer distinct. He was a silhouette against a backdrop of swirling, iridescent mist, his edges blurring, merging with the nascent chaos. He made no sound, no movement, simply stood there, dissolving. My own body began to feel porous, my senses merging. I could taste the light, hear the colors, feel the impossible textures of the shifting reality against my skin. My thoughts, once linear and logical, became fractured, impressions rather than words. The distinction between Marcus and the world around me blurred. My consciousness stretched, thinned, became a thread woven into the tapestry of the corrected existence. I was no longer an observer, but a participant, an infinitesimal mote in the vast, incomprehensible order. The hum resonated within me, through me, as if I were a new instrument in a cosmic orchestra. What was I now, in this new symphony of being?